It has now been 365 days since George Floyd lost his life, and today the world is pausing to remember him.
His death sparked cries all across the world for police reform, for social justice, and overall for change. And the aftermath of his death has also taken a toll on many people's mental health, leaving behind lingering emotional trauma.
I find that a lot of us are dealing with some level of collective grief.
Licensed therapist trained in clinical trauma, Sierra Hillsman says for many people, the trauma of seeing the cell phone video of Floyd's death was heightened by the pandemic.
Everybody's sitting at home. They have no choice but to view this on their television screens or on their news feeds.
Data from the Census Bureau shows a spike in people identified in health screenings as suffering from anxiety or depression 1 week after George Floyd's death.
I do have a son, so seeing all of this that's happening in the world, period, has impacted us a lot mentally, emotionally, physically sometimes.
8 minutes and 46 seconds. What have we lost as humanity when we can stand by and watch that?
Reasons that are cited for the hesitancy among African Americans in taking the vaccine for COVID-19 is what happened in Tuskegee, Alabama. It was a horrendous violation of ethical standards, a violation of human rights, and one more example of the savage racism that is the history in this country. People may not realize how trauma moves through generations.
In what many are now calling intergenerational trauma. It impacts families, it impacts communities, and that's really what we're seeing with the hesitancy with this vaccine. There's knowledge of past abuses.
James Farr, live from Pasadena Media Studios. Get ready for more piercing and provocative. The Conversation Live starts now. And welcome to another episode of The Conversation Live. The Conversation Live focuses on social justice, restorative justice, inclusion, and equality. Coming up today, Gina Ross is in the studio. Gina is the founder of the International Trauma and Healing Institute. We're going to have a critical and possibly uncomfortable conversation. Let's go ahead and welcome Gina into the seat. Gina, how are you?
Hi, James. Very good. Nice to see you today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. And folks, I just want to tell you, we're going to kind of break script a little bit from how we normally do the show today, because I decided that I want to show up vulnerable today. I want to unpack and kind of process some of the things that I've experienced. So we're going to talk about some officer involved shootings. We're going to talk about COVID. We're going to talk about how generational trauma it impacts people. So Gina, thank you so much for being here today. Tell me a little bit more about your background. How did you get started in this work? And then we'll deal with me and my issues in just a little bit.
Well, I don't call myself that way, but I'm a refugee twice overnight. My family left 2 countries overnight because of danger to our people and our families. So was very important for me also is because my background is very mixed, and I wanted to have all of the parts of my cultures be able to live together in peace. So that was one of the reasons why first of all, I was doing actually therapy, like spiritual therapy. And then when I realized how much trauma impeded spirituality in people, that's when I turned my eyes towards trauma and saw the damage that it causes around the world and wanted to do something about it.
What were some of the things you discovered?
So I thought at first that I was going to ally the media by writing a book for them to be like my allies in sending out in the world what we call the healing vortex. And then I realized that they also perpetrate trauma and heal it. They have the potential for both. And while I was doing that research, I realized there were 10 social sectors that do that, either perpetrate or heal trauma or both. And so I realized how ensconced in society it is, in all communities, really. And we found a way. There's a wonderful technique called somatic experiencing that really understand that trauma is in the nervous system. And we found a way to take that work to lay people through some tools that really help people do self-regulation without having to do deep trauma and all of that stuff. Not that I'm against deep trauma, I'm a therapist, okay? But so that was the goal. The goal of the Institute is to spread the healing of collective trauma by engaging the collective healing vortex and really take the tools to all populations all over the world. And in that way, we will be able to diminish violence and suffering and everything that comes with trauma.
And our role, and sometimes I, accept being a part of the media, and sometimes I kind of reject it, and I guess that's selective depending upon the context. But in that, I'm exposed to a lot, in the work that I do, the film, not Walking While Black. That's my buddy's friend that also traumatized me. But Thorns on the Rose, Black Abuse, Corruption in the Pasadena Police Department. It contains some pretty graphic and violent things. And I understand in my capacity that I'm, perpetuating that. Let's take a look at a scene from the documentary. And let me set this up. It is immediately following the homicide of Anthony McLean. And we'll see community members kind of rallying around the officers. And I want to get your reaction to that. So Josh, let's roll in this next video and we'll talk with Gina on the other side.
Stop reaching. Hey, I'm going to help him. Hold on. Go. Get back. Go. Hey, I got pressure, okay? Hey, I'm trying. Back up.
Yeah, it's never easy, watching that again. But when you see the crowd, the anger, the anxiety, the hostility, what are those people experiencing at that time, Gina?
I think it's two things. I think it's secondhand trauma just from watching traumatizing scenes, and that's everybody. But at the same time, that is more than likely to open up a whole, what we call a history of abuse, an album of abuse that the community has suffered. And then everything opens up at that point. And then it's not secondary trauma anymore. It's first-hand trauma. So I think it's a combination of the two, depending on where people are on the spectrum. So I can see where a lot of very kind of kept aside from time to time feelings can really come up to the fore. And there's also, on top of it, we have our own individual traumas that we suffer that don't necessarily have to do with collective. Sometimes they are influenced by the collective and sometimes they're not. They also come to the fore and are added to the whole thing. So it's pretty explosive mix that happens when like that.
When you say it's secondary, and I've heard it described as, vicarious trauma, but it's secondary. So does that secondary?
I mean secondary. I mean secondhand trauma, meaning
secondhand trauma.
You're not the one who is being held right now. You're watching this. So that's just from watching, like people, for example, who are working, NGOs who are working with traumatized people can end up suffering from secondhand trauma with the same symptoms as the traumatized.
And what are those symptoms? Like, how does that show up in a person? So, in case somebody's watching this and they kind of want to understand, like, why am I feeling this way? Like, what's wrong with me, or is something wrong with them?
No, there's nothing wrong with me feeling that way, but those are symptoms of trauma when they come up. And the reason, and we normalize them, it's normal that we have them. The question is whether we keep them or we help release them. I think that's what's going to make the difference in how we continue in life and how we also repair what needs to be repaired in society. So there are all kinds of different symptoms that happen. There are physiological symptoms where people can have tachycardia and tension and chronic tension in the whole body, develop migraines, develop chronic pain. Then you can have mental symptoms, and that would be more like a black and white thinking, very no gray areas, no nuances in the way we look at the situation, distorted belief systems about the self or about the world. At the emotional level, you can have distrust and anger and hatred. At the behavior level, the real desire for revenge. You want to seek justice through revenge, and that's all we can see at the time. So a huge amount of anger that's explosive, that manifests into other things that we do in society or in our families, or how we abuse ourselves too, because anger can be turned towards the self or towards others. So the difference here, what I really want to emphasize, which I have found crucially important, is to realize that the anger is very justified. And then we have to differentiate between toxic anger and healthy anger.
What do you mean by that? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So toxic anger is when I am so angry and it's so overwhelming my system that the only way, for example, I can see relieving anything, and it'll be only momentary anyway, is, let's say, through revenge or through hurting myself or hurting others. So that would be toxic anger. If I do healthy anger, and so I can discharge that toxicity, I can discharge the excess of the anger, and then I have this really healthy, centered, reasonable, not reasonable, but capacity to reason in the right way. How am I going to get more potent in the way, in what I'm doing? How am I going to be more empowered to get the message across, to make the changes that I want to do? And when they come from a center place, that anger then becomes a guiding line for one's life. And you have a lot of people who suffer from trauma, and then they get it, and they give their lives to a mission of how to make society better and the world better and humanity better. And so that's the difference, I think, between really understanding that we have toxic anger and healthy anger. And our job, each one of us, is to discharge enough of the toxicity, of the excess energy in our body, so that we're coming from a place that's guided by anger, but in a compassionate way. And not even that, I don't even care about the compassionate way, in an effective way. An effective way, in general, encompasses also compassion.
Yeah, I know last year around this time, following the George Floyd murder, and as there were social justice movements and rallies around the nation, Pasadena was no different. Thousands gathered in Centennial Circle in front of City Hall. And, I said I was mad as hell. And I didn't understand in that moment, what I was doing to relieve myself of, that anger, and I felt, I didn't know how to feel about saying that, but I later learned that it was healthy to honor that. I want to talk about some solutions and healing and generational trauma, but let's first, just again for context, let's roll in this next clip, and we'll talk with Gina on the other side. Josh, let's roll that in, please.
A powerful discussion tonight about race relations in Rochester during a News 8 town hall this evening. Several community leaders lent their voice to this event. Among the topics, fear. The fear felt by many in the Black community before the death of George Floyd, and fear felt by many in many groups now following this weekend's unrest. Christian Garzone dug a bit deeper into that emotion and tells us what one therapist had to say about this. Christian is joining us now.
Therapist Kara Juzek says what we're all going through right now is a sort of collective trauma, all of this affecting us in various ways mentally, and it might be time to keep ourselves in check.
And then you face this sort of trauma and you have to deal with that. And a lot of times we just keep moving forward.
DJ Rain with WDKX talking at a News 8 town hall tonight discussing race relations following the death of George Floyd and the destructive responses over the weekend. Pastor Marlo Washington also touched on the emotions surrounding the issue and unrest.
This is the contributor of the physical and the emotional, psychological, and spiritual abuse.
My first reaction is sadness.
After town hall, we spoke with therapist Kara Juzak. She says while you have the built-up emotions within the Black community, what we're seeing now is contributing to collective trauma and affects many people in various forms.
As we're experiencing this large-scale crises, I encourage people to have ways of coming back to basics.
She says things like the community cleanup yesterday is a perfect example of coming together and focusing on positive emotions. It's a way to heal.
People are coming together as we do during crisis, and there's always efforts to find connection.
If so, Juzak says it might be time to check your mental health for trauma and reach out. But the biggest thing we can do right now,
listen to each other.
Now, Juzak says we're all going through these negative emotions. We can also learn to heal together as well.
All right. Healing is something that, you know, I'm learning. It's achievable.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Go
ahead.
Go ahead, Gina. I don't.
Hey, what a beautiful message, really. The question now is to have the tools. Yeah.
The tools. But there's not a light switch, right? I mean, you just can't click yourself into healing.
No, it's a process. It's a process. But, you know, sometimes I say to clients that come to me, the fact that you realize that you wanted to do some changes for yourself, you're already halfway through done. You're already halfway done with the process just by taking that decision. So there is a click. There can be a real potential of a click. And this is, I think, what the role of the media and what you're trying to do is so phenomenally important. It's like you can click the trauma vortex like that. You can click the healing vortex too. And then it's a process. It's actually a personal process that each person can go through. But there are also collective processes, collective rituals that can be done by every community for each community that is being in trouble and help in the healing that way.
I'm going to put a image up here of your book, Trauma Vortex into the Healing Vortex. And are some of the tools that we've been talking about that can be found in your book?
Yes, they can. They are in the book is all about that. It's actually for the lay public. And the video that I sent you is also, it's like a representation, a video representation of what's in the book. It really guides you in 15 minutes to really know how to use those tools. It's really quite astounding. And there's a doctor who created this technique because he understood, and you know where he took his information from is how animals in the wild reacted. What did they do? And he realized that there were inherent mechanisms of healing, of self-regulation that are built in. And then when there's too much happening for us, the nervous system gets overwhelmed, and then that inherent mechanism is not working anymore. And our task simply with those tools is to put it to work again. So when I realized that there actually is an inherent mechanism to heal in every single person in humanity, that's when I thought, wow, global healing now is possible because of that. Because otherwise before, how are you going to take every single person through years of therapy? It doesn't make sense. We cannot reach a lot of people that way. But then all of a sudden, 15 therapy, James, showed up in the last 20 years that are short-term and that lay people can do on themselves. And I thought, wow, that's the message that it's time to engage in collective healing. And that's what the whole work about the books and the Institute is all about that.
How does your reptilian brain kind of play a part in, you know, how you experience trauma? Fight, flight, or freeze is what we're talking about, folks.
Exactly. So normally we are, again, designed to be able to protect ourselves, and we go into fight and flight, or fight or flight when we are in danger. And there's a whole bunch of stress hormones that gets released in our body to give us the power to do that. If we cannot do it for whatever reason, then we go into the freeze, which then means that this excess energy, powerful energy, is now stuck in the nervous system. Because when I get to fight or flee, I actually use up those stress hormones, and my nervous system get back to balance. But if I go into the freeze and I don't discharge the freeze, then that energy is stuck in my body, and that's what turns into symptoms of all kinds, as I said: mental, psychological, emotional, behavioral, physiological. Now, the beauty about it, just one second, the beauty about it is that there's an inherent mechanism that allows me to discharge the stuck energy in my body. All I have to do is some very simple actions or awareness that I'm going to bring to my body. I'll explain that a little bit in more details. But it's very simple. It's very organic and built in.
What is that? I'm curious. You got me.
So I'm glad. This great. So what is the language? So you talk about the reptilian brain, and that's exactly where the trauma is. It's the dysregulation of how in the autonomic nervous system, and how the sympathetic and the parasympathetic are working together. They stop working in a complementary way, and they come stuck together. So the language of the reptilian brain is the language of sensations inside of the body, meaning if my breath is short or deep, if I have constriction in my chest, if I have a lump in my throat, if my temples are throbbing, if my jaws are tight, if I have butterflies in my stomach. Those are the sensations that we're talking about. Those sensations are actually indication of that stuck energy in my system. It's my entry to the trauma. And here's the miracle. If I just focus, let's say my heart is beating very fast, and I just focus on my heart beating fast, just putting my attention there, something will happen automatically, not from my willpower, that will help discharge that sensation and bring back my heartbeat to normal. And then there are signs of discharge, and there are a deep breath that comes by itself. We call it the reptilian breath. Yawning, trembling and shaking throughout the body, especially the limbs. Heat wave, warm sweat, gurgling of the stomach, or goosebumps. And instead of being scared of them because they're involuntary, it's like, oh my God, what's happening to me, right? We don't stop them. We allow them to be. We give them the time, which is what we didn't have during traumatic events. We did not have the time for our nervous system to digest and resolve the traumatic energy that was aroused in us.
Okay. Last thing, because we only have a few more minutes before we have to get out of here, and I appreciate you taking this time and explaining this to me, and it's helpful. But I want to talk about generational trauma and epigenetics. What role does that play? What have my ancestors experienced that may have been passed down through genetics, and how does that show up in me today?
It is huge. It's passed, we call it epigenetically. It's passed sometimes through the DNA. It passed through the womb of a woman who is stressed, for example, or under the environment, like women who are pregnant during war and they are under missiles or something like that. Their kids will have more tendency to be traumatized, more easily traumatized. So we know for sure that there is generational trauma and that it can be passed through the generation. Something happened recently, though, that was really amazing. I was listening to some speech of a rabbi at a synagogue, and she said, well, the same way that the trauma vortex, she didn't call it trauma vortex, I'm calling it, is passed generationally, the healing vortex can also be passed epigenetically. And I went like, wow, I didn't think about it that way. I just thought about let's heal, let's break the pattern of trauma, of generational trauma. But she put it in such a way that I thought, okay, epigenetically transmitted healing vortex. So I think today it's really what you're trying to do. Each one taking the responsibility, each one of us taking the responsibility to come from a rational place, from a loving place, from a compassionate place, from a humanity connection place, is contributing to what I call this collective healing vortex. We're all responsible for it. There's no such thing anymore as just our politicians or our reporters or our journalists. It's really based in each one of us. And you see it. A lot of people are making wonderful efforts. And my dream is to have a media that so much understands the power of the collective healing vortex that they will go reporting as often all acts of healing vortex as they are reporting acts of trauma vortex.
All right, Gina, we're going to park it right there because we're hard up on the time. And I am so appreciative that you've taken some time to talk with me, talk with the audience. We're going to go ahead and put your book back up again. Again, it's the Trauma Vortex into the Healing Vortex. And I'll put down in the comments, folks, how you can order that book and learn more about it, as well as Gina's contact information.
And also the video too, if you can put that information underneath the book.
I most certainly will. Again, thank you, Gina, for being here. Stand by. You're watching The Conversation Live. The Conversation Live focuses on social justice, restorative justice, inclusion, and equality. My guest today was Gina Ross, and she is, I'm just going to call her a collective trauma expert. And she's helped me unpack some things, and hopefully she shared some things with you. It is May. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. I'd also like to look at it more like mental health wellness. But until we have another opportunity to speak with you, as always, agape.